Good afternoon, and welcome to Ranney School's virtual Capstone presentation series. These seniors have worked exceptionally hard all year to research their topics in order to produce a sizable written project, as well as the presentation you are about to see. As a reminder, the presenter can't see your comments in the chat in real time, but I can. So at any point during the presentation, you can post questions or comments. At the end of the presentation, I'll ask for questions to be submitted in the chat, and I'll pick some of those out to ask our presenter. In the largely male-dominated world of professional politics, women are seen by some as ineffective or incapable of establishing themselves as forces with which to be reckoned. That, according to Summer's capstone, is bunk. Over the course of this year, Summer researched the roles of women in politics both in the United States and abroad and came to some interesting conclusions that I'm excited for her to share with you now. Summer, how are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. Are you ready to present?
Yeah.
All right. Without further ado, here's Summer Abdelbarry with The Efficacy of Women in Politics and Leadership.
So, hi guys. My name's Summer, and like he just said, my research was on the efficacy of women in politics and leadership. So, with this, the first area that I looked into with my research was the psychology behind the differences between men and women, just essentially what psychological behaviors distinguish a man between a woman. So, in this, I researched the psychological and biological differences, and with women, I found that female have just this stronger maternal instinct, obviously, from giving birth to a child. They have a stronger affinity for empathy and a greater basal capacity to show control over their emotions, which essentially just means that in certain situations, they are able to control their emotions far easier than men are. Men show a greater tendency to show aggression and violence, and they have less of an ability to show control over their emotions in stressful situations, which is actually very important in the political field. But in my research, I found that there was no inherent difference between their intelligence or their ability to multitask, which are both important for this career path. So the next question I asked was, how would these differences be applicable to politics? And these psychological differences are actually important because they carry themselves over to being relevant in the political. So one area in particular where this is apparent is in the content of bills that female politicians in the US Congress choose to sponsor. These bills have received the nickname of women's issue bills because they're disproportionately sponsored by congresswomen and supported by female politicians. These bills are generally ones that look to reform healthcare, education, and their desire to support these types of bills specifically can be related back to the psychological maternal instinct that they feel that they need to nurture and protect, because healthcare bills disproportionately help mothers or families. It's just when you sponsor a healthcare bill, it really looks to provide support for families, which is, I think, the main reason that female politicians feel so inclined to support them. And also education, of course, is geared towards children. So because women are generally more empathetic, like in their psychology, that's what I found. They feel more of an emotional connection to these bills, and that's why they want to sponsor them and why they want to see them through to completion. Another way that their empathy is important in their role in politics and as legislators is in the idea of surrogate representation, which is essentially just the idea that because there are so few women in politics, the ones that are there and that manage to get into the political field, they feel a desire to not just represent their self or their own district or constituents, but all women because they have such little voice. So the first case study that I did, because across my research I did case studies looking at 3 different countries to see how females lead in all of these countries. I looked obviously to the US first, and the US Congress, the Senate, and the House. So first thing I looked to was what challenges women face in Congress, and the main ones that I found were underrepresentation, obviously, because there's not a 50-50 ratio. Misogyny is another big issue just because of like the systematic idea that Congress is kind of this man's club. And sexual harassment is another really big issue that has come up as more women have entered Congress. So the next section that I looked to was motivation, like what motivates these women to succeed if they've gone this far and gotten into politics, and how can this be tied back to the psychology or whatever I was talking about before. So I looked, and again, the biggest thing that I found was this idea of surrogate representation, which is these women feel an obligation to support not just the people that they're representing through their district or whoever voted for them, but all women in general, because their voice is just not really heard because, again, there's not a 50-50 ratio. So, again, they're motivated by the idea that they want to protect children or families of any kind. It's the desire to support healthcare initiatives that are beneficial for young children. And you can tie that one back to the maternal instinct that I talked about before. And then some successes that they've had in Congress. So there are obviously so many examples of instances which women have been successful in Congress because of how long they've been there, but just a few examples are the Women, Peace, and Security Act of 2017 that was sponsored by the female representative of South Dakota, Kristi Noem. It was introduced in May of 2017, and it passed in the House just 1 month later in June of 2017. And for a bill to pass that quickly, it takes a lot of push because some bills take years to pass. And at the same time, Florida Senator Marco Rubio introduced the North Korean Human Rights Reauthorization Act of 2017, and the bill has still yet to pass in either the House or the Senate. So the Women, Peace, and Security Act of 2017 falls under that category of women's issue bills that I talked about before, just because obviously it helps to protect gender equality. And Noem herself even stated that she felt that she had an obligation to see the bill through to its completion and success because she felt a personal connection to it. So this is just one of those instances where a female congresswoman was able to pull off what a congressman couldn't just because she felt a deeper connection to the bill than Marco Rubio felt to the North Korean Human Rights Reauthorization Act. He just didn't feel that it was his obligation to see it through to immediate completion. And then in 2009, Congress began working on the healthcare reform initiative that was later pushed by President Obama. For months, Congress met, but nothing passed. But when Nancy Pelosi was chosen to head the project, a bill hit the floor and passed in less than 2 months. And this was a project that they had been working on for some time. So these women have remained successful in spite of all these challenges that they have faced, like sexual harassment, which is another issue that I want to talk about. So Congresswoman Jackie Speier created this entire Me Too initiative in Congress just so other congresswomen and people that were actually spread and became this very huge campaign. And if you think about it, like to see that a campaign could spread like wildfire through Congress, there must be a lot going on that just isn't spoken about. So my biggest thing was just if these women have remained successful in spite of these challenges, it kind of shows resilience and it does show their competence. The next area that I looked to was Germany and the entire EU. So I looked at Angela Merkel, who is the Chancellor of Germany. Merkel's early life. So throughout her childhood, Merkel lived and grew up in communist-ruled East Germany. Her father was a heavily Lutheran pastor, and he was known to sympathize with the Communist Party. Because of her father and family's influence, religion continued to play an important role in her life throughout her political career. Later in life, after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the reunification of East and West Germany, she joined East Germany's Evolved Democratic Party in 1989. In the first Democratic East German election, she was elected deputy spokesman for East Germany's first ever elected prime minister, and after this, she continued to grow in her positions, and she was elected to a seat on the German parliament. And soon after, she was elected chancellor and the CDU's party leader cabinets as the prime minister for women and youth. So she worked under the current prime minister at that time. Then soon after, in 1994, she was appointed minister for the environment and reactor safety. And then eventually she became the first female chancellor of Germany. So it's apparent just through her swift progression and elevation in political positions that Merkel has had a very successful career despite being the first ever female to lead Germany in a disproportionately masculine political atmosphere. But she was a very successful career politician. She still is. Some of her successes include the resolution of the economic crisis, which I'm going to talk about later because it was very important with her role in the EU. Elterngeld, which was an initiative to support couples who have children. In this program, parents are provided with more than a year-long paid maternity or paternity leave that's funded by the German government and taxes. So this was just very important in increasing Germany's population, and it proved to be successful when she did it. The psychology of sponsoring those women's issue bills kind of comes into play here just because it supports families. She had led the largest nuclear plant shutdown in all of German history and was very instrumental in the refugee crisis in Germany. So this is Angela Merkel's impact on the EU, and the biggest area that this comes into play with was the impending collapse of the euro and her resolution of the economic crisis. So in 2008, 2009, right when America was having their problems, Europe was also plagued with one of its worst economic crises of all time, the impending collapse of the euro, which is their currency. After uniting an entire continent economically through the establishment of one form of currency, it became way easier for countries in the EU to take out loans and lend money to others. But because of this, a lot of countries were in serious debt. The worst of these was Greece because they kept lying about their financial situation to keep receiving loans and get into the Eurozone with other European nations. They kept borrowing until their internal economy essentially just collapsed. And they were unable to pay their loans. They just kept defaulting. And to ensure that this calamity would not completely damage the European economy, it called for decisive, fast, strict, and effective action. And given the size of the continent and the vast membership of the EU, the government took a while to act because they just didn't know what to do. And Merkel came in and she was like, we need to do strict, decisive action, very strict, tightly wound economic policy. And everyone was like, this just isn't a way to get every single country on board. So she did it in her own country. And in Germany, Merkel took that strict, decisive, and effective action that Europe would need in order to survive economically. And she recommended multiple times that the EU implement similar sanctions and tight supervision on all economic transactions just until economic stability returned and could be restored. Her approaches were aggressive, but obviously effective, considering Germany was the first country that managed to recover the fastest from the near economic collapse. And a lot of the countries in the EU followed soon after. So it is like really obvious just through her swift progression and elevation in all these political positions that she has had a very, very successful career. And that is important to note just because she was the first female to ever be chancellor of Germany. So for her career to be this successful and be known as being a very successful one, that's important. The next country that I looked to was Liberia. So the Liberian Civil War, for over 100 years, the American-Liberian population was in charge of all government operations since the founding of its country. But the native Liberian population was kind of shut out and they were underrepresented, underheard. They were basically just the minority group and when they were the majority. And in 1980, Samuel Doe became the first Liberian president who was not an American-Liberian after infiltrating a coup against the old president. There was systematic instability in the country just because of this really strange social hierarchy where the American-Liberians were seen as so superior. But then a larger scale conflict began when Charles Taylor, who was an ex-member of President Doe's government, left after he was accused of fraud and embezzlement, and he created the National Patriotic Front of Liberia. This party eventually expanded and joined Prince Johnson's Independent National Patriotic Front of Liberia and created an even larger, more powerful organization. This organization's ultimate goal was just to take down Doe's government and gain absolute control over the city of Monrovia and just lead the country. This was important just because Taylor was an ex-member of Doe's government, so this coup that he led was really sneaky and kind of tore the whole government apart. But then 2 years later, after the coup, Liberia held elections for the presidency and National Assembly, and Taylor and his party won by a large margin after this, and they came into power. So there were 400,000 to 620,000 people who died throughout this civil war, and the Liberian people were so tired of tragedy that they thought if we just elect him and we can end it, we'll just finally have a stable government back. But Taylor continued to just dole out various parts of the government to members who were warlords and just wanted it for the money, wanted to look for diamonds and just embezzle funds. So these warlords started their own personal militias. They each began to recruit young men and continued fighting over territory, and this led Liberia into its second civil war. So this civil war was stopped actually by this organization, the Women of Liberia Mass Action for Peace organization. So this is 3,000 some women who joined forces in their peacekeeping efforts, and they managed to achieve peace within the country after a 14-year civil war. They were motivated by their families. So this relates again back to the psychology that I know I keep stressing it, but this really seems to be, in my research, I found a very important factor in what motivates these female leaders and politicians. So they were motivated by a desire to protect their families because these warlords kept recruiting young men and husbands. So these women were losing their sons, their husbands, their fathers, their cousins. Everyone was just getting taken to go fight in this war that they, in their minds, did not need to be fought. Religion played a very important role. So this organization of these women was actually founded by Christian and Muslim women that came together and wanted to figure out a way to peacefully end this war. And then culture and sex also played a role, which I'll talk about in their methods. So the methods that they used to try to get these men to stop fighting were very unconventional because obviously they're using guns, force, and brute, but these women are trying to find a peaceful resolution. So they sat outside the Capitol building in these white outfits and would just sing songs and like cries for peace. And finally, the warlords met to have a meeting, but in the meeting they sat there for a week and they couldn't figure out a way to get anything done. They just kept fighting, and this was trying to create a resolution to the civil war, and the women saw that no resolution was being come to. So they went to the hotel that they were staying at, that these meetings were at, and they sat in the lobby and protested. And when they were trying to be forcefully removed, these women would strip. Because in Africa, it's a curse if a woman that's your elder strips in front of you. So the men would be too scared to stop them. They'd go back into the building and they'd be forced to try to figure out another resolution. They'd come out, try to leave, the women would strip again. So they'd have to go back in and try to figure out a resolution. And this kept going on until finally they created this peace treaty that was the only one that was ever created throughout this civil war. Is it good? Okay. So obviously they were successful because the Civil War ended, but um, they got the warlords to negotiate, which after 2 years was just seemed like an impossible task. They eventually ended the majority of the fighting that was going on, and the Liberian Civil War just kind of it didn't resolve itself, and there still is so much instability in the country, but it created this new kind of idea of women's roles in the country, and Liberia actually ended up being the first country in Africa to ever have a female president after this, which is pretty cool. This is just an excellent example of women's abilities to be effective leaders and peacemakers because in being able to successfully pioneer an end to a 14-year civil war, the Liberia Women Mass Action for Peace organization demonstrated that the female approach can at times be more successful than the males when it's more calculated and uses less violence and more thought. In addition to this, by managing to end the violence and bloodshed, they proved women's strength and commitment as leaders, even in the settings of war, which women were previously thought of as unable to contribute or unhelpful. So this was my final chapter, and after I finished looking at the case studies in all of these countries, I sought to compare the equivalent male and female politicians and their actions and successes throughout their careers. So first, as I talked about Nancy Pelosi multiple times in my presentation, I chose her. She was the 52nd, and she's the current Speaker of the House of Representatives, and Paul Ryan, who is the 54th Speaker of the House of Representatives. So he came in between her first term and her current term. So Paul Ryan, who's pictured on the right, throughout his career, the two biggest initiatives he attempted to carry on with were the Path to Prosperity and the Better Way, both of which wanted to privatize Medicare and convert Medicaid into a grant program. These initiatives were unsuccessful because of how drastically he wanted to revise and reshape the budget to make it come to fruition. He wasn't very successful in accomplishing what he set out to in the beginning of his career, but Paul Ryan was instrumental in the passage of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, and that was a really big project, like as any major tax reform bill is. But overall, Paul Ryan's time as Speaker of the House is known for a very large increase in government spending with the deficits that his initiatives left the government with. And I'm comparing him with Nancy Pelosi, who's pictured on the left. She is the 52nd. She was the 52nd and is the current Speaker of the House right now. She was instrumental in making advances for women by becoming the first Speaker of the House. And moreover, Pelosi was also the first person in 60 years to regain her position as Speaker after already having completed a term. Throughout her time as Speaker of the House, Pelosi led a passage of multiple bills and initiatives that benefited millions of people. Just some of these include the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009 that saved millions of Americans' families and jobs after the financial crisis, the Student Aid and Fiscal Responsibility Act that saved taxpayer dollars and restructured the financial aid system, and the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, which fought pay discrimination by providing more legal access to women. Pelosi was also kind of the brains behind the construction of the Affordable Care Act that I talked about before, and she was the driving force behind the bill's passage. It's obvious just by looking at the sheer number of bills passed during Ryan and Pelosi's tenures that Pelosi is obviously the more effective Speaker of the House, with her 111th Congress being called one of the most productive Congresses in history. There's no question that Pelosi has proven herself to not only be a competent politician and legislator, but to be effective as well, even despite the idea that she was the first female Speaker of the House or that she is a woman. Next, I went back to Germany with Helmut Kohl and Angela Merkel again. So Helmut Kohl was a chancellor from Germany from 1982 to 1988, and Angela Merkel is the current chancellor of Germany, as I talked about before. So Kohl, pictured on the right, proved to actually be a very successful legislator throughout his time. He was the creator of the Maastricht Treaty, which established the stable currency throughout Europe as the euro and created the European Union. So his main goals were to focus on Germany's domestic economy and ensure its stability and to promote German unification and integration with the rest of Europe. Kohl had a very successful career as chancellor, but he was unfortunately involved in this donation scandal that made him lose a significant amount of trust from the European people. But he was a very effective leader, and he did a lot of great things throughout his time. And then Angela Merkel, pictured on the left, she actually followed a lot of Kohl's policies and kind of used him as a guide for how she shaped her political career, just because early in her career, Merkel worked with Kohl and as kind of like his protege and planned on continuing with his successes. So in her time as chancellor, Merkel has effectively diffused the economic crisis that plagued through Europe, returned Germany to a stable economy, instituted programs such as Elterngeld that helped families afford to have more children, began some of Germany's first ever energy reform programs, and taken a compassionate stance during that refugee crisis. So Merkel's career has been full of successes, just as Kohl's was. By looking at these two successful career politicians and their accomplishments side by side, it's evident that they both possess similar abilities and have both been incredibly successful. This again just affirms my theory that women are not innately less effective legislators and politicians than men. Finally, I looked in Liberia again with Charles Taylor, who was the president that led the coup, and then the Liberian Mass Action for Peace organization. Even though they're not a political figure, they or a political organization technically, I am counting them as one just because they were such an influential force in Liberian politics. So Charles Taylor was the 22nd president of Liberia. He's pictured on the right. His political career wouldn't exactly be described as wholesome. He was a convicted war criminal. He incited a coup over former president and his former boss, Samuel Doe. In 1997, he ran for president, and his slogan was, "He killed my ma, he killed my pa, but I'll vote for him." During his presidency, Taylor halved the amount of people employed in the armed forces, which led to thousands of people losing their jobs and the country falling into complete chaos. He was also not so secretly involved in the Sierra Leone Civil War when he conducted weapons exchanges for blood diamonds. And then the Liberian Mass Action for Peace organization was the organization that managed to achieve peace in the country after the 14-year Civil War. Again, although they're not really an individual that can be compared to Taylor, as an organization, they were able to benefit Liberia more than Charles Taylor did throughout his entire presidency. And as discussed in my chapter about Liberia, this organization worked for months, joining together two religious groups employing the use of various tactics, such as sex strikes, peaceful protests, song, just to try to end the fighting and suffering within their country. Through this, they displayed their strength, and in this effectively brought some kind of resolution to this conflict that was plaguing the country for so long. And this, I think, just really shows that females can be very effective as leaders. So essentially, what Charles Taylor did was exploit Liberia for his own personal and economic gain and do way more harm to the country than good. But this organization spent days, weeks, and months protesting, campaigning, and fighting until they were able to restore peace and stability back to the country that they love. And I think through this, we can really see that women, when they're motivated by fear and love of their families and their countries, they're far more effective leaders and far more beneficial to people than Taylor, who was motivated by greed and proved to be a detriment. Um, in conclusion, all things considered, by looking at these successes over the three different continents, it's pretty clear that female success in politics and legislation isn't just a one-off, and rather that women truly do have the potential to incite change in the world of politics when they persevere. Through this research, my biggest goal was I really hope to debunk the idea that women are somehow less effective legislators and politicians than men just by delving deep into the successes of female politicians. In disproving this antiquated belief that politics is somehow this man's world, I hope my research will help us propel towards a new way of thinking. And I just kind of wanted to leave everyone with one question, and it's just if women can be equally, if not more, effective legislators and politicians than men in certain instances, then why isn't there an equal representation of men and women in politics? Thank you.
Well done, Summer. Congratulations. You've completed Capstone. We're going to take a couple questions now, but before I get to some of the community questions, I'm curious, what is it that led you to this topic in particular that you wanted to spend a whole year researching it?
So I obviously am very passionate about politics and the political world, but in particular because I am like a woman of color and I really hope to in my future work in the world of politics. I know that it would be a struggle, so I just kind of wanted to research like is there any really ground towards why there aren't more women in politics, and that's kind of what guided a lot of my research.
Okay. Ms. Greenberg asks, is there a quality you think women are bringing to political action and dialogue that leads to greater success?
Yeah, definitely throughout my research, the biggest thing that I could say was compassion. Compassion is something that women just seem to be just inherently more receptive to, and that's just very important in politics. And I think that sometimes that's something that seriously is lacking.
Okay. Let's see. Lucy asks, do you believe that women can bring a different and important perspective to politics, perhaps one that we've been lacking for some time?
Yeah, 100%. And I think, again, it relates back to just that idea of compassion and empathy. And that's something that in the political world, especially when it comes to things like war, that's why I loved the example of the women in Liberia. Sometimes just an empathetic and compassionate perspective is really lacking in politics. And that's something that women tend to provide disproportionately more than men.
Okay. Ms. Curry asks, do you have, here we go. Do you have a hypothesis as to why so many countries have had women prime ministers and presidents, but not the United States?
If I had to guess or hypothesize, I'd say it just has to be cultural. Just the United States again has that idea of just this man's club that is the government and is Congress. So it's hard to break that mold of what it is. And we're doing well by introducing more women, but I think it just takes more time when you have such a strict mold like that. Whereas other countries, maybe their molds aren't as strict, if that makes sense.
And a related question from Dr. Spencer is, why do you think men and women are unwilling to elect more female leaders?
I think it's just the idea of the fear of the unknown. Like that's why again, that's a big reason of why I wanted to do this too, is just you're scared to elect someone that you don't know if they're going to do a good job. And because there are so few, you don't know if the women that are doing a good job, it's just a one-off or that's just how they can do it. You know what I mean?
Sure. Just going down the list here, Miss Patient asks, would you consider it less about men versus women than power brokers versus nurturers? Like, can you see the difference between those two perspectives?
Yeah,
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I definitely think that's a really good point. Just because in some points when I was doing my research, I was getting frustrated with the idea of this divide between genders just because I was finding so many similarities that like you could have that idea where like a power broker could be a woman in some case, and it just the idea of just dividing it by genders was frustrating me at some point. So I could definitely see that there would be a different way to divide it.
Hmm. Hazel asks, is there any particular woman you've researched that is a personal role model to you, or
Uh,
even that you didn't research?
well, like my personal female role model is definitely my mom, but political politics wise, I did put the women that I think I really admire with Nancy Pelosi and Angela Merkel, just because of how successful they've been. So those two would definitely be some idols of mine.
Okay. Uh, let's see. Miss Soriel says, "Beautifully done, Summer. Would your research suggest that women are more differentiated than men in their ability to resist external influence, like financial and power motivators?"
Yes, and I didn't really include this much, but in Congress, especially with bill passage, the idea behind why women get more bills passed is because they remain more focused and they don't listen to as much outside influence as men, and they cannot be persuaded as easily as male politicians can.
Do you mean persuaded by
Not,
by lobbying firms, or by like sign,
I don't. I'm.
evidence?
Yeah, it's not more evidence. It's um, the example that they used was that if a man presents this bill and there are other male politicians that want to like change it or adjust it, they're more receptive to listening to those changes. I don't know if it's receptive, but it's they're more willing to just adjust so that everyone will be pleased by it.
Mhm.
Whereas women, they do that also just because it's difficult for them to get their bills passed, but they stand more firm in the content of the bills. They're less they're less likely to change like what the whole core of the bill is.
Okay.
That makes
Uh,
sense.
yeah, absolutely. Let's see. Do you have any ideas on how we can get more qualified women to run for office?
I think that just comes with educating youth because as time goes on and little girls get to see more female politicians, they'll think that that's a career path that is accessible for them, and then they will go and educate themselves and they'll be able to run as an educated female politician.
All right. Well, I'll just say one last time, Summer, congratulations. You finished Capstone with it, your Ranney education. Uh, so well done. For everybody watching, we have one remaining capstone presentation. John Kokoza will be on at 2 o'clock to present his thesis on the state of the American electoral system. So continuing with the political theme. I hope you'll join us and have a great day.